Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who is joining us in this conversation about Covaxin vaccine against COVID-19. If you're watching us on Twitter, please use the hashtag AskWHO. If you're watching us on other platforms, please use comments to send us your questions. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mariangela Simao, who is Assistant Director General for Access to Medicines, Vaccines and Pharmaceuticals, and also by Joachim Hombach, who is WHO Senior Health Advisor and representative of the SAGE Secretariat. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you for your time. Especially we organized this session in a very short notice because we know that there's very, very high interest in Covaxin vaccine, and WHO has just issued emergency use listing for this vaccine. So Mariangela, maybe we can start with you explaining to our viewers how this process has been done.
Thank you, Alex. And I think this is very important to clarify because WHO has the pre-qualification of vaccines program for many, many years, more than 20 years. And in the situation that we are living now with the COVID pandemic, we did issue last year what would be the procedures for the emergency use listing of COVID vaccines. Now, this procedure is available online. You just Google it and you'll find it. And I'd like to highlight because it's a very structured process. The procedures are based on internationally recognized standards for both the clinical trials, the good manufacturing practice, and other issues that are important when you're talking safety and quality of any health product. So the process starts with the company, the industry, submitting to WHO information and asking to start what we call the rolling submission for an emergency use listing. And then WHO does the analysis, the companies produce the information that's needed for the assessment, and at the end of the process, WHO submits all the findings, everything that contained on it, submits it to an external technical advisory group. In the case of Bharat, which is the producer of Covaxin, this expert group was composed of 6 experts from 6 different countries, all different nationalities. This group meets and recommends WHO to proceed with the listing of the vaccine or not. In the case, we are very happy to be announcing today that the TAG with the Technical Advisory Group, met today, recommended that the WHO proceed with the listing of this vaccine. So it's now listed.
Thank you so much, Mariangela, for explaining this and for sharing the good news. Maybe also, can we explain as well, what does this emergency use listing of this vaccine mean for people who have already received this vaccine, but also for those who will have access to it?
Yeah, let me just complement something I forgot also to say. When I was saying that it's a very transparent process because you can also access online. WHO updates almost, every week the status assessment of all COVID vaccines that have been submitted for an emergency use listing for WHO. So this is also available online. You can see when it started, when it was finalized, for which sites, and so on. So this is a very transparent and public process, as I was mentioning. Now, how does this affect people and what does it mean for individuals, right? Actually, the emergency use listing, the purpose of doing this is to facilitate international procurement. Also, because every country has their own national regulatory authorities, and then they can authorize or not a vaccine to be used in their territory. But how does UNICEF, for example, who's a big procurement agency for vaccines, buy? They buy based on WHO's emergency listing or pre-qualification in the regular vaccines. So it's intended, the primary intention is for international procurement. A second intention is to facilitate the assessments at other countries, not the country of origin. India is the country of origin. But WHO makes the assessment available to the national regulatory authorities in other countries. So if they wish to buy Covaxin or they want to use Covaxin, they can have quick access to the findings of WHO, WHO emergency use list. And this is a process we call reliance. So they rely on WHO assessment to issue the market authorization or the registration at country level. And, but everyone knows that we are seeing a movement internationally on countries imposing conditions or preconditions for travel for different vaccines according to their own national legislation. I'd like to make it very clear that WHO does not condone the travel requirements of vaccines right now, because we have such an inequity in the world in access to vaccines. It's very difficult if you have a country that has 4-6% coverage, and someone wants to travel abroad and they had not access to vaccines. It should not be an impediment. But many countries are using right now WHO emergency listed vaccines as a precondition to enter their country, besides the national authorization. So this is an extraordinary use of the emergency use listing, and it's intended to facilitate entry only those who have had access to one of the vaccines that WHO listed or that were approved at national level. Again, this is not the procedure WHO is pushing, because we want that vaccine actually become a reality across the world. Not for some countries will be allowed to travel, but this is in place in many countries right now. So we are saying if countries are to use any form of vaccine certificate, they should use the WHO approved vaccines, emergency approved by WHO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariangela. And you already covered some of the questions, especially about the travel that our viewers have been asking. Joachim, there are questions about what is the type of this vaccine and who is it for to be used? And we have already recommendations from the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. So can you please share?
Yeah, happy to do so. I mean, the first thing is that I think it's important to mention in relation to the guidance that WHO is issuing on the use of the vaccine, which is different from the emergency use listing that was just explained by Mariangela. So we are, in addition, providing guidance on how to best use a vaccine in the population. And so this has indeed been discussed by SAGE already a few weeks ago, but the position will actually be released also today in conjunction with the emergency use listing. So we'll be posting today the so-called interim recommendations on the use of this vaccine, and that these interim recommendations summarize the basic findings, but then they provide the detail on the best use of the product in the current circumstances. So it is a vaccine, just to summarize, it is a so-called whole virion inactivated vaccine. So it's a relatively classical vaccine. Essentially, virus is isolated and grown on cell culture, inactivated. And this is essentially the vaccine as it's been used. It's formulated with adjuvant. There is a novel adjuvant that is actually being used in this vaccine, which is supposed to provide some benefits. So it's a relatively classical vaccine, and it's administered in a 2-dose schedule, 2 months apart. 4 weeks apart. So that's the makeup of the vaccine, and we have obviously looked at the clinical data, the safety data. We've also looked at the data that have become available through the use in India, and so this is what has formed the position that WHO has formulated that we'll be posting today.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Here is the next question that maybe you can take. It's coming from Dr. Sakar watching us on Twitter. What is the protection against hospitalization from COVID-19 after receiving the full course of Covaxin vaccine?
So we have the data from the clinical trial. The clinical trial was done with the classical endpoint that you use in these studies, which is any confirmed COVID case. And we have here an efficacy that was estimated, I think, in the range of 79%. There were relatively few cases of more severe disease, so the estimation of the effectiveness or efficacy against severe disease is more difficult, but it is reasonable to assume that this effectiveness is higher, as we see for all of these products. But the clinical trial has not given, didn't have sufficient power in order to estimate the efficacy against severe disease.
Thank you so much, Joachim. I would just remind our viewers that we're talking about Covaxin vaccine following the emergency use listing that's been granted by WHO to this product earlier today. There are also questions about whether this vaccine will need a booster dose. So do we have any information on that at this point?
We need to monitor the situation. Some of you may have seen that WHO has recently recommended for 2 inactivated vaccines manufactured in China, the administration of what we call an additional dose, so a 2+1 immunization schedule for older adults. This has been done on the basis of a number of data in relation to the effectiveness rollout of the vaccine in a number of countries, as well as immunogenicity data. We do not have sufficient data in relation to Covaxin, so we need to monitor the situation. We know that traditionally, we know this from all vaccines, that the immune response and also the duration of immunity can be somewhat lower in older people, so that's something that needs to be monitored. But the vaccine has a slightly different setup. It has, as I mentioned before, a specific adjuvant, so it could well be that we see here a prolonged immune response that does not need this additional dose. And whether in the longer term booster doses will be needed is something that obviously needs to be monitored. It needs to be driven by data. It needs to be driven by really a clear documentation of waning immunity. And as we all know, the immunity that is the most important is the immunity against severe disease. So if we see that this is something that wanes with time, then certainly there would be a need for a booster. But we don't have the information for the time being, and so we don't have a recommendation for the time being.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Here are some questions coming about the side effects of this vaccine and also how this vaccine has been administered. So maybe to start as well, how people do receive this vaccine, and then whether they can expect some side effects.
So the vaccine is classically administered intramuscularly, and it's 0.5 milliliter. And in terms of the reactogenicity, again, it's a very classical inactivated vaccine with a very limited number of side effects. So what you can expect is local reactogenicity, some swelling at the or redness at the site of injection. And in terms of so-called systemic effects, you can have eventually headache, modest fever, and things like this. There were no really serious adverse events related to the vaccine shown in the clinical trials, and also nothing of particular note has been observed so far in the rollout of the vaccine. Again, this is something data that were reviewed again by a dedicated committee of WHO, the Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety. So it's clearly a very safe product.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Mariangela, some of our viewers are asking about the access to this vaccine. So do we know where is it accessible at the moment? And maybe we can also explain how COVAX uses or delivers vaccines that have been approved through the emergency use listing.
Oh, thank you, Alex. First of all, you know, the COVAX is the mechanism that WHO, Gavi, CEPI, and other partners have organized to to consolidate some actions to facilitate access to the different vaccines. And one of the prerequisites is that these vaccines are emergency use by WHO. As far as we are aware, we haven't had a submission from Bharat yet. No, but in time we are not over. You know that there is a huge access for in different parts of the world, and there is an interest in Covaxin partners, including in the portfolio vaccines that have both been proven to be safe, efficacious, and quality assured. So this is where we are right now. I'm not sure about which countries are using Bharat's vaccine, which is Covaxin. So far, we know that it was heavily used in India, and the assessment for the emergency use listing was based mostly in data originated from India.
Thank you so much, Mariangela. Our viewers are asking as well, do we know for how long does the efficacy of vaccine last after receiving the full course of 2 doses?
Yeah, that relates to some extent to the question that was asked before in relation to the booster. So there is ongoing studies, monitoring, so-called observational studies on the vaccine. And so these are data that need to come in that are awaited. So for the time being, we do not have data on waning immunity duration of effectiveness, but this is something that comes in and that will obviously influence any adjustments to the policy as to additional doses or booster doses, but that remains to be determined.
Thank you so much, Joachim. We are receiving a few more questions. Oh, please go ahead, Mariangela.
No, can I just add, because this is not unique to the Covaxin vaccine, right, Joachim? This is because we have most of the vaccines, all vaccines that we're using them widely since January this year. So there's a lot that we still have to learn about the immunity, how long the immunity will last for, not only for Covaxin, but for other vaccines as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Joachim, our viewers are probably joining a little bit later, and they are asking again, who can receive this vaccine? So maybe you can explain again on age groups and maybe some vulnerable populations who should be as a priority receiving this vaccine.
Yeah, so the vaccine is recommended for essentially anybody above the age of 18 years. We know that in India, there is also a pediatric indication. I believe these data have not yet been submitted to WHO, so our recommendation is 18 years and above. And it is essentially for all populations. We have, again, that's independently of Covaxin, we have prioritized populations, namely those that are particularly vulnerable to COVID. And these are obviously older populations, people with certain comorbidities. Also pregnant women, I can say to this a few words in a minute. So I think these are the populations that for whom this vaccine is recommended. We don't really have populations for which we do not recommend the vaccine. There's no particular contraindication. We have a contraindication in relation to hypersensitivity to components of the vaccine, which I think haven't been reported yet. So it's essentially good for all populations, adult populations. We have looked also very carefully into the issue of pregnancy. And we are also recommending the use of the vaccine to pregnant women on the basis of a benefit risk assessment, given the fact that obviously the data we have on pregnant women are at that point in time limited. We have very little data from the clinical trial. We have some non-clinical data that are supportive, and there's obviously some experience also on the use of the vaccine in India. So we are open for using this vaccine or administering this also to pregnant women, but on the basis of a benefit risk assessment and the communication to the person in terms of the available data.
Thank you so much. Here's the next question, also from a Twitter viewer. What is the difference of Covaxin vaccine comparing it to the other EUL-approved vaccines?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question. Maybe I'll try to answer more broadly, because we have approved different platforms so far, right? It's inactivated mRNA vaccines, viral vectors, and so on. And I will use the opportunity to answer something that has been coming up in terms of the timelines for the approval of the different vaccines, right? Because you know, the process we have is called a rolling submission process. So the company starts to provide data to the WHO, and from the time until the finalization through the assessment of the technical advisory group, several things can happen. You know, and the speed depends very much on the availability of data. Not only the availability of data, but also the submission of data to WHO, right? So we have had vaccine, including an Indian vaccine that was approved within 1 month of the initial submission. And we have had vaccines that were initiated, the process initiated in maybe February, March, and which have not been finalized yet. So from the beginning until the final decision on the Covaxin, it took around 3.5 months, which is a good timing, a good time. I think I would like also to recognize that Bharat provided the information as it became clearer, the needs and the specific queries to different aspects of the clinical trial data, or different aspects of the good manufacturing practice, the CMC data, and everything else. Bharat was very responsive. So the process took, all in all, 3.5 months. We have vaccines that took more than 6 months so far, and we have one vaccine that's taking longer than that.
But just to add, maybe, since Mariangela referred to the platform, so basically we have so far seen 3 platforms that are of vaccines that are emergency use listed. We have the mRNA vaccines, we have vectored vaccines, and we have inactivated vaccines. And so this is the 3rd inactivated vaccine that joins the growing list of emergency use listed vaccines. It is similar, but nevertheless different to the 2 other inactivated vaccines. It's based on a different strain, obviously, and it has this so-called toll-like receptor agonist as an adjuvant that is supposed to give a specific, how shall I say, twist to the immune response, a so-called Th1 response, which is believed to be particularly useful and favorable in terms of establishing immunity against COVID.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Here's an interesting question, and a few of our viewers are saying or asking whether COVID vaccines can impact fertility and impotence. So can you clarify if this is true or not? It is in general for COVID vaccines, not necessarily just for Covaxin.
I mean, we have absolutely no indication that this is the case. And there is also no biological plausibility. I think that's the other thing. There is absolutely no biological plausibility why there should be a linkage between a vaccine and the immune response it triggers and fertility. This has, by the way, been claimed also for other vaccines, also for non-COVID vaccines. I think these are very unfounded claims that are bar of any data nor any type of plausibility that comes from the biological mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Here's the next question, whether children under 5 can be vaccinated against COVID-19.
Well, we have, I mean, first of all, among the vaccines that are emergency use listed, there's currently none that is recommended for that age group, right? We have a vaccine that is recommended from 12 years onward. And we know, I mean, those who follow the developments very closely might have seen that the United States actually just yesterday recommended the use of one of the mRNA vaccines from 5 years onward in a slightly reduced concentration. That's going on. None of these data have been submitted to WHO, so that's, so to say, on the vaccine performance side. The other aspect that needs to be taken into consideration is the need to immunize children. As we know that in children and also in adolescents, the burden of disease is much lower. So from WHO's perspective, at that point in time, the vaccination of children and adolescents, aside specific subpopulations and adolescents with specific conditions that make them very vulnerable, is not a priority. That is, of course, something that will evolve as the pandemic evolves, as more supply becomes available. But it is not, in the current situation where we are, it's not a public health priority. And again, speaking for WHO, we have not yet reviewed these data.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Here's another interesting question on Covaxin vaccine in particular, because you mentioned it used a strain of a virus. So our viewers are interested which exactly strain has been used. Do we know? Because some think or are asking whether the Delta variant strain has been used for clinical trials in this vaccine.
It's one of the original strains isolated in India, obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, right? I think it's actually a strain that comes from an Italian traveler, but never mind. It was a strain that was isolated in India. It's of course closer to the original strains. It's not a Delta strain. We know, however, from the clinical trial as well as from immunological studies that there is cross-protection and cross-reactivity against a number of strains. I think in particular it has been shown for Alpha, it has been shown for Delta, I think it has been shown for Kappa. I would need to go into the documentations for more details, but this has been shown. So I don't think there's anything specific in particular in relation to the strain that has been used for this vaccine.
Thank you so much, Joachim, for clarifying this. And maybe before we close the session, Mariangela, questions for you about production of this vaccine. Do we expect it to be produced elsewhere in other continents and sharing the technology, or not at the moment?
Thank you. I think it's very important that there's increased production of vaccines and also in different continents and so on. And I'm happy to say that we are in negotiations with BARDA to join what we call the COVID Technology Access Pool, which is a platform that WHO coordinates with other partners where it's possible to share technology, share know-how, and also share licensing through the medicines patent pool. So this conversation is ongoing already, and that would allow for a good basis for technology transfer to other countries. But if I may, because just that we are about to end, Alex, I just want to pick up on the question that came on fertility and impotency, right? Because I think it's very much super important the moment we live right now to be aware of the misinformation, right? Which is feeding into the anti-vaccination movement. It's feeding on people having doubts about vaccine, doubts about if they are safe or not. And we are saying the vaccines that have been assessed by WHO are safe. They have been proved to be safe. They have been proved to be efficacious and quality assured. So it's very important that everyone who's listening right now look for information and confirm any information you have in the WHO website, where we have a lot of users-friendly information about the different topics on health, but especially on the vaccines that are being used against this SARS-CoV-2. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariangela. Thank you, Joachim. This was very helpful, and there was quite a lot of questions and interest in this vaccine. So I thank to all our viewers from France, Uganda, UK, India, Panama, South Africa, Macedonia, Netherlands, US, Nigeria, Norway, Australia, Vietnam, Mauritania, South Korea, Kenya, Nigeria, Thailand, Indonesia, and many others for being with us and for asking their questions. For any more information on COVID vaccines and on COVID in general, please stay with us, follow our social media channels, our website, and we will share new knowledge and information as we also get it. Thank you so much again, and goodbye.
My pleasure.